The first time I realized I had the power to end someone's career, I was standing in line for bad coffee. Not a dramatic setting, no boardroom, no spotlight, just a paper cup that tasted like regret and a cracked tile floor in a federal building no one ever notices unless their life is already falling apart. A man stood 2 feet in front of me, mid-40s, expensive suit, confident posture. The kind of person who speaks in complete sentences even when he's ordering caffeine. He was laughing on his phone, bragging, not loudly, but loud enough, about how a minor adjustment in reporting had just saved his organization millions. He said, "No one checks that layer anyway." I remember thinking how strange it was that he felt so safe saying that out loud. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the layer he was talking about had my fingerprint on it. Not my name, not my face, just my logic, my structure, my rules. He finished his call, turned slightly, and smiled at me in that polite, dismissive way powerful men smile at women they assume are irrelevant. I smiled back, because 10 minutes earlier I had approved a system update, and 10 minutes later his phone would stop ringing. By the end of that week, journalists would start asking questions he couldn't answer. By the end of that month, his board would quietly remove him for strategic reasons. And by the end of that year, his name would be a footnote no one wanted to be associated with. He would never know it was me. That's the funny thing about power. The most dangerous kind doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need permission. And it definitely doesn't introduce itself. My name is Lena Ward, and this is the story of how people who thought they decided everything learned what it feels like to be decided for. The meeting room was colder than it needed to be. That wasn't an accident. Someone, years ago, had decided that seriousness required discomfort, and no one had questioned it since. Power, I'd learned, loves unnecessary rituals. I arrived 7 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because arriving exactly on time makes people assume you're replaceable, and arriving late gives them an excuse to dismiss you. 7 minutes early puts you in that awkward zone where no one knows what to do with you yet. The room slowly filled with people who knew exactly where they belonged. Marcus Hale entered last. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Rushing implied reacting, and Marcus believed reacting was for people without leverage. He moved like the meeting would not start until he decided it would, because functionally, that was true. He took the central seat without looking around. Someone slid a tablet in front of him. Someone else poured water. No one asked if he wanted it. They already knew. I sat along the side wall, second chair from the door. No nameplate, no microphone. My badge faced inward, mostly because I forgot to flip it, partly because I didn't care. To them, I was a consultant. Temporary, technical. The kind of role people nod at without listening. Marcus cleared his throat. "Let's begin." Everyone leaned forward. I stayed still. The agenda appeared on the screen. Funding reallocations, impact metrics, policy alignment. Words that sounded ethical enough to excuse almost anything if arranged correctly. Marcus spoke about communities, about responsibility, about data-driven compassion. He had a gift for saying nothing in a way that sounded like leadership. I watched the numbers instead. They were clean, too clean. Rounded edges where there should have been friction. Outcomes that curved upward with suspicious obedience. At one point, a council member asked, "Are we confident in the integrity of the risk model?" Marcus smiled. Not wide, just enough. "Our systems are robust," he said. "We've had the same framework in place for years." That was technically true. Framework, not execution. I felt a strange, familiar sensation. The one that comes when you realize you're the only person in a room who understands what's actually being discussed. It's not empowering at first. It's isolating. Like watching people dance to music you can't hear. The meeting moved on. No one asked me to speak. That was also intentional. Afterward, as people gathered their things, Marcus finally glanced in my direction. "You're Lena, correct?" he asked. already half turned away. "Yes," I said. He nodded. "Send your notes to my assistant." I almost laughed. Notes? As if I had been there to observe, not to maintain the very system that validated every decision he'd just made. In the hallway, a younger analyst walked beside me. Nervous energy, new shoes. "Big room," he said, attempting conversation. "Big egos," I replied. He snorted before he could stop himself, then looked horrified, like he'd just insulted a deity. That was humor number 1, I suppose. Watching someone realize too late who they might have offended, when the only offended party was the illusion itself. Back at my desk, a borrowed one in a shared office that smelled faintly of toner and burnt coffee, I logged in. My credentials worked instantly. They always did. I pulled the latest deployment logs. Quiet changes, small overrides, nothing dramatic. Just enough nudging to redirect outcomes without triggering alarms. Whoever had done it knew the system well, or thought they did. Here's the thing about decision-making systems. People assume the power lies in the final call, the vote, the signature, the announcement. It doesn't. Power lives upstream, in what options are even presented. You don't have to force outcomes if you control the menu. By mid-afternoon, I had confirmed what my instincts already knew. The system hadn't failed. It had been guided, steered carefully away from populations that didn't generate political value and toward initiatives that photographed well. Ethics optimized. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tile above me. Cracked, water-stained, ignored. It reminded me of how institutions treat anything that doesn't immediately collapse. At 5:30, Marcus walked past my desk. He stopped, briefly. "You settling in all right?" he asked, performing concern. "Just reviewing historical parameters," I said. "Good," he replied. "No need to reinvent anything." He smiled again, polite, certain. That was humor number 2, though he didn't know it yet. Because I wasn't there to reinvent the system. I was there to remember what it was supposed to be, before people like him learned how to bend it without leaving fingerprints. As he walked away, I opened a secure folder I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were archived protocols, original weighting logic, safeguards that had been labeled inefficient and quietly disabled. I didn't activate anything, not yet. I just read. And the more I read, the clearer it became. No one would stop this. Not because they were evil, but because stopping it would require admitting they didn't fully understand it in the first place. People protect their authority more fiercely than they protect others. That night, as I left the building, the security guard nodded at me like I was furniture he'd seen too often to question. Outside, the city hummed. Lights, sirens, indifference. I checked my phone. No messages. That was fine. Silence has always been my strongest credential. And tomorrow, I would decide whether to keep listening, or whether it was time to let the system remember its own rules. The first thing I did the next morning was nothing. That sounds unproductive, but restraint is a skill most people in power never learn. They act too quickly because movement feels like control. Silence, on the other hand, terrifies them. I arrived at the office at the same time as the day before. Same borrowed desk, same burnt coffee smell, same assumption that I was there to support decisions already made. Marcus was already in a smaller conference room, glass walls, shades half drawn. He was meeting with 2 board members and a representative from a private donor group. I wasn't invited. That was expected. What wasn't expected was how little effort they put into hiding it. The door wasn't fully closed, no white noise machine, no encryption active on the internal network. They spoke in the lazy shorthand of people who have never been challenged by consequences. I didn't need to listen in. I had logs. Every time someone accesses a report, adjusts a threshold, or reclassifies a category, the system records it. Not loudly, not in a way executives ever bother to look at, but faithfully, like a witness who doesn't care whether you acknowledge them or not. By 10:30, I had mapped 6 months of subtle changes. Each one, by itself, was defensible. Together, they told a very specific story. Projects tied to politically inconvenient populations were consistently downgraded in long-term viability. Emergency reallocations favored regions with upcoming elections. Risk factors were reweighted to make certain outcomes appear statistically inevitable. It was manipulation disguised as math. That's humor number 3, if you appreciate irony. People who can't balance a personal budget confidently steering multi-billion-dollar impact models because numbers make them feel intelligent. Just before lunch, an email hit my inbox. From Marcus Hale. Subject, quick check-in. He wanted to see me. That was new. I walked into his office carrying nothing but a tablet. No notebook, no bag. I'd learned early on that people take you less seriously when you look prepared. Prepared suggests intent. Marcus gestured to the chair across from him. "Lena," he said, folding his hands, "I've been reviewing consultant feedback." That was a lie, or at least a misrepresentation. He didn't review feedback. He filtered for inconvenience. "I wanted to ask," he continued, "if you've noticed anything concerning." I let a few seconds pass. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to make him uncomfortable. "Define concerning," I said. He smiled thinly. "You know, inconsistencies, irregularities." I thought of all the words he didn't use. Manipulation, bias, abuse. "There's a difference between system drift and intentional recalibration," I said carefully. His eyes flickered. He hadn't expected precision. "And which do you think this is?" he asked. I met his gaze, calm, neutral. "I think the system is doing exactly what it's being told to do." He leaned back, relieved. "Good. That aligns with our understanding." Of course it did. He dismissed me with a nod, already moving on to his next concern, his next call, his next carefully worded lie. Back at my desk, I pulled up a projection. If nothing changed, within 18 months the data would justify cutting support to 3 entire regions. Not because the need disappeared, but because the model would eventually define them as unsustainable. People wouldn't starve because of malice. They'd starve because of math. That's the danger of systems like this. They don't feel cruel. They feel reasonable. They give people the comfort of inevitability. I could fix it. Not loudly, not by exposing anyone, not by blowing the whistle, a phrase used mostly by people who've never paid the price of doing so. I could restore the original safeguards, rebalance the weights, force transparency back into the decision tree. But doing that without authorization would end my contract instantly, possibly my career. I stared at the screen for a long time. If you were in my place at that moment, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have intervened, knowing it could cost you everything you'd built? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Around 4 o'clock, Daniel Cross messaged me for the first time in years. "Still watching the river?" I smiled despite myself. That was our old code. He meant, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" I typed back, "The current's stronger than before." His reply came almost immediately. "Then someone's steering." I locked my screen and leaned back. This wasn't about Marcus anymore. He was just the face, replaceable. The kind of man who mistakes position for permanence. This was about who gets to decide outcomes while pretending not to. At 6, the office emptied. Lights dimmed automatically. Another decision made without discussion. I stayed. Not to act, just to prepare. Because once you touch a system like this, you don't get to pretend innocence again. You either accept the cost of knowing, or you accept the cost of changing things. And one of those costs is always higher than people expect. Tomorrow, I would make a choice. Not one anyone could see, but one everyone would eventually feel. People like Marcus believe power announces itself. It walks into rooms confidently. It sits at the center of tables. It speaks first and last. That belief is why they never see the real threat coming. The next morning, the system updated automatically at 6 a.m. like it always did. Same maintenance window, same checksum verification, same green confirmation banners that executives glanced at once a quarter before declaring everything stable. Nothing looked different. That was the point. I didn't change outcomes. Not yet. I changed visibility. The first adjustment I made was almost boring. I re-enabled a dormant audit trail, one that had been quietly flagged as non-essential 3 years earlier because it slowed down executive dashboards by half a second. Apparently, transparency is inconvenient when you're in a hurry to justify decisions. By 9 o'clock, the system was still behaving. By 10, it was watching. At 10:30, Marcus called an emergency check-in with the analytics team. Emergency in this case meant something feels off, but I don't know why. I wasn't invited. I listened anyway. The conference room's internal mic wasn't encrypted. Another oversight. Another assumption that no one without a title would dare pay attention. "Why are we seeing variance spikes?" someone asked. Marcus responded quickly. "Probably noise. The model recalibrates constantly." "But the variance is tagged," another voice said. "Like it's intentional." Silence. That silence was delicious. I allowed myself a small smile. Humor number 4, I suppose, the kind where the joke is that no one in the room realizes the punchline is them. By lunchtime, the audit trail had done its job. Every manual override, every reclassification, every temporary exception now sat neatly documented, time-stamped, and traceable. No accusations, no alarms, just facts. Facts are terrifying when they can no longer be ignored. I grabbed lunch alone, sitting on a concrete bench outside the building. A man walked past, talking loudly into his phone about owning the narrative. I watched a pigeon steal half his sandwich when he wasn't looking. It felt metaphorically appropriate. Back inside, Daniel called. "You're lighting things up," he said without greeting. "Only rooms that already had wiring," I replied. He exhaled. "They'll notice." "They already have," I said. "They just don't understand what they're seeing." That was the dangerous part. Confusion makes powerful people reckless. At 3 p.m., Marcus sent another email. From Marcus Hale. Subject: Quick clarification needed. This time the tone was sharper. Less performative concern, more irritation. I walked to his office. He didn't offer me a seat. "We're seeing data artifacts," he said. "You wouldn't happen to know why?" I tilted my head slightly, not in confusion, in consideration. "Artifacts usually come from exposure," I said. "When something hidden becomes measurable." "That's not what I meant." "I know." He studied me then, really looked, as if noticing for the first time that I wasn't nodding along like everyone else. "You understand how sensitive this work is," he said carefully. "Misinterpretation could cause unnecessary disruption." "Disruption to what?" I asked. He hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. "Operations," he said. That was the wrong answer. "Transparency doesn't disrupt operations," I said. "It clarifies them." His jaw tightened. "I hope you're not suggesting we've done something improper." I met his gaze. Calm, neutral. "I'm suggesting the system now reflects reality more accurately." He dismissed me again, but this time there was no nod, no smile, just irritation wrapped in authority. By 5, the board had requested a full internal review, not because of morality, because donors were asking questions. That's another thing people misunderstand about change. It rarely begins with ethics. It begins with discomfort. Ethics follow once ignoring the problem becomes inconvenient. I stayed late again. This time I wasn't alone. Daniel joined me in person, sitting across from me in the shared office, looking older than he had in my memory. less angry, more tired.
"They'll try to isolate you," he said. "Blame a contractor, a misconfiguration."
I know.
You prepared for that?
I didn't come here to be liked.
He laughed quietly. Good, because you won't be.
We reviewed the data together. The patterns were undeniable now. Anyone with basic literacy could see them, which meant the next step wouldn't be denial. It would be narrative control.
"They'll say the harm was unintentional," Daniel said. "A flaw in design."
That's why I didn't change the design, I replied. I restored it. He looked at me, something like admiration crossing his face.
"They won't forgive that."
I'm not asking them to. At 9, as I packed up, I noticed something new in the system logs. A query. Not from Marcus, not from the board, from an external oversight body. Someone else had started looking. I paused. This was no longer just internal politics. This was momentum. And momentum, once it starts, doesn't care who gets crushed underneath it. As I shut down my terminal, I felt the weight of the choice I'd already made, even if no one else could see it yet. Tomorrow, the conversation would change. Not because I raised my voice, but because the truth had learned how to speak for itself. The shift happened quietly. No announcement, no emergency email, no dramatic confrontation. Just a subtle change in how people looked at me. The next morning, when I walked into the building, the security guard checked my badge twice. Not because he thought it was fake, but because he suddenly wasn't sure who I was anymore. That hesitation was new. Power hates uncertainty. Inside, conversation stopped when I passed. Not abruptly, just a half-second pause. Like static, like interference. Marcus didn't come into the office that day. That, too, was new. Instead, an all-hands review was scheduled for the afternoon. Mandatory attendance, cameras on, notes recorded. The kind of meeting people call when they need witnesses more than solutions. I took my usual seat along the wall. No one asked me to move. The board chair opened with a carefully rehearsed statement about values, alignment, and continuous improvement. Words that sound like action but require none. Then the questions began. Not accusations, not yet, just clarifications. Why had certain override patterns become visible now? Why were legacy safeguards suddenly reappearing in reports? Why were journalists requesting background information on impact discrepancies? The analytics team looked panicked. They'd built careers on trusting outputs they didn't design. Marcus joined remotely, his face framed by perfect lighting. He looked composed. Tired, but composed.
"This is a technical misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "We've already identified the source."
Every eye shifted toward me. Not sharply, cautiously. I felt something almost like amusement. Almost. Lena's contract included system familiarity, Marcus continued. It's possible a well-intentioned adjustment caused confusion. Confusion. That word again. I waited. Lena, the board chair said, forcing a smile, would you like to clarify? This was the first time anyone had asked me to speak in that room. I stood, slowly. Not for effect, just because rushing feels defensive. I didn't introduce anything new, I said. I restored existing protocols that were disabled without documentation. Silence. Marcus frowned. Those protocols were deprecated. Decoder means inactive, I replied, not unauthorized. A board member leaned forward. Are you saying someone bypassed approval? I'm saying the system now shows who made which decisions, I said. Before, it didn't. That distinction landed. This wasn't a moral argument. It was procedural. And procedural failures scare institutions more than ethical ones, because procedures are how they protect themselves.
The chair cleared his throat. And do these restored protocols affect outcomes? Yes, I said. They make trade-offs visible. Trade-offs we previously accepted, Marcus interjected quickly. I turned toward the screen, toward him. Accepted, I said, or obscured. He stiffened. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse, didn't editorialize. I just let the question exist. The meeting ended with no conclusions, just an agreement to review further, which translated meant find a way to contain this. Afterward, Daniel found me near the elevators. They're circling, he said. I know. They'll try to frame you as the risk. I expected that. Most people would panic. Most people don't understand what actually scares them. He raised an eyebrow. They're not afraid of me, I continued.
They're afraid that the system no longer lies quietly. That afternoon, an internal memo went out. All system changes now required additional approval layers. Temporary freeze on deployments. Oversight committees formed overnight. It was chaos disguised as control. By evening, my access was downgraded. Not revoked, that would have looked suspicious. Just limited. I laughed softly when I saw it. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. They were trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. At home that night, I reviewed everything one more time. Not to interfere, just to make sure the records were complete, immutable, distributed. If they wanted to scapegoat me, they'd have to explain why the data still spoke without my involvement. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. This is Elaine Porter, a woman said. Office of Federal Oversight. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, I said. We've been reviewing documentation connected to Hale Initiative, she continued. Your name appears frequently. That's not surprising, I said. I designed part of the system. She paused, measuring. We'd like to ask you some questions. Of course. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. This was no longer about internal reform, or even accountability. This was about exposure. And exposure has a cost, not just to the guilty, but to anyone standing too close when the lights come on. If you were in my position, knowing that answering honestly could end your career or redefine it in ways you can't control, would you step forward anyway? Or would you let the system protect itself and walk away untouched? Tell me what you'd do. The next day, Marcus resigned. Not publicly, not dramatically. He cited personal reasons. The board thanked him for his service. No one mentioned the data. But the oversight review didn't stop, and neither did the questions. I returned to the office one last time to clear my desk, the borrowed one, with the faint smell of toner and burnt coffee. As I logged out, the system prompted me with a final message. Access terminated. Fair enough. I stepped outside into the city air, lighter than I expected to feel. People think power ends when your access does. They're wrong. Sometimes, power begins the moment you're no longer needed to keep the truth contained. And somewhere behind me, a system designed to quietly decide fates had started doing something radical. It was telling the truth. Losing access didn't feel like losing power. It felt like confirmation. For years, I'd watched people confuse proximity with authority. They thought being near the controls meant owning them. They thought visibility equaled influence. What they never accounted for was momentum, the kind that keeps moving long after the hand that started it steps away. The first headline appeared 3 days after Marcus resigned. It wasn't explosive. It didn't name names. It didn't accuse. It simply asked a question. How objective are impact models used in federal policy decisions? That was enough. By noon, there were 4 follow-up pieces. By evening, the word oversight started appearing where innovation used to live. Institutions hate that word. Oversight implies someone is watching. Worse, that someone might understand what they're seeing. Daniel called me that night.
"They're scrambling," he said. "Not to fix anything, to explain why they don't need fixing."
Of course they are, I replied. It's hard to admit you benefited from something you didn't want to examine. I was no longer under contract, no badge, no borrowed desk, no access to internal dashboards. What I did have was something far more dangerous: consistency. Every dataset released publicly matched the internal records. Every question journalists asked could be answered by documentation that already existed. No leaks, no anonymous tips, just alignment. Truth doesn't need amplification when it's coherent. I met with Elaine Porter 2 days later. Her office was smaller than I expected. No dramatic seal on the wall, no intimidating silence. Just a woman who looked like she'd learned the hard way that authority doesn't require theatrics. She didn't ask me why I did it. She asked me how. So I told her. I explained the system the way I always had, as a series of choices disguised as inevitabilities. I showed her how weighting factors quietly shaped outcomes, how temporary overrides became permanent, how ethics could be diluted without ever being removed. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "You realize they'll say this was accidental." "I know," I said. "And that you're expendable." "I was always expendable," I replied. "That's why I could act." She smiled faintly. Not approval, recognition. Here's the thing about people who think they decide everything. They assume everyone else is motivated by ambition, titles, security, advancement. They never understand people who operate without needing credit. The board issued a statement the following week, carefully worded, apologetic without admitting fault, promising reforms without specifying timelines. It fooled almost no one. Funding paused, partnerships hesitated, advisory roles were quietly declined. Marcus's name stopped appearing in professional contexts. He called me once. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, I just had nothing left to say. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe, watching a group of interns argue loudly about who would end up running things someday. They spoke with absolute confidence, unaware that most systems don't reward certainty. They reward alignment. I wondered which of them would eventually learn that lesson the hard way. The review expanded. Other organizations came under scrutiny. Similar patterns emerged. Not conspiracies, not villains twirling mustaches, just incentives left unchecked. People like to believe corruption is loud and obvious. In reality, it's often polite, reasonable, well documented. That's what makes it so effective. Daniel sent me a message with a single sentence. "They're rewriting policy language." That was bigger than any resignation. Language defines reality in institutions. Change the language, and you change what's possible to question. I walked through the city that evening feeling lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant, not relieved. Clear. I didn't know what came next, and for once, I didn't need to. Power had shifted. Not to me, away from a few hands that had held it too comfortably for too long. People would argue about intent, about blame, about outcomes, but the system would no longer pretend neutrality while practicing preference. And that was enough. Tomorrow, someone else would decide whether to preserve that clarity or slowly bury it again under convenience and jargon. The difference now was simple. They couldn't say they didn't know. And once knowledge exists, it has a way of outliving the people who tried to contain it. The invitation arrived without ceremony. No embossed letterhead, no flattering language, just a calendar request with a neutral subject line. Policy alignment discussion. That was the first clue. Institutions don't invite you back unless they need something, and they never phrase it honestly. I considered declining, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I'd learned that once your usefulness ends, proximity becomes risk. Still, curiosity has its own gravity. And besides, refusing would have been interpreted as guilt. So I accepted. The meeting was held in a different building this time. Smaller, older, less glass,
less pretense. The kind of place where decisions are made quietly and explanations are written later. 3 people waited inside. Elaine Porter sat at the far end of the table. 2 others I didn't recognize. 1 legal, 1 operational. Neither smiled. They didn't offer me coffee. That told me everything I needed to know.
We're restructuring oversight mechanisms, the legal one began. Your prior involvement gives you context. Context, that word again. It's what institutions use when they don't want to say culpability. I'm not under contract, I said calmly. No, Elaine agreed. You're not. The operational lead leaned forward. But you understand the architecture better than anyone currently advising us. That was true, and they hated that it was true. They wanted my help without restoring my authority, my expertise without my autonomy. The system wanted to learn from the person it had tried to discard. There's humor in that, if you appreciate irony. The kind where the same people who locked the door now want to borrow your keys. What exactly are you asking? I said. Elaine met my eyes. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. I almost laughed. Almost. Systems don't repeat mistakes because they forget. They repeat them because incentives remain unchanged. That depends, I said. Are you prepared to lose control? Silence. The legal advisor cleared his throat. We're prepared to adjust governance. I nodded. That's not the same thing. They exchanged glances. I let them sit in the discomfort. Here's the thing most people don't understand about decision-making power. It doesn't fear exposure nearly as much as it fears decentralization. Exposure can be managed. Distributed authority cannot. I won't consult, I said finally, but I'll advise. On what terms? The operational lead asked. I leaned back. I don't report to you. I don't submit drafts for approval. And I don't attend meetings designed to dilute outcomes. The legal advisor frowned. That's highly irregular. So was the manipulation you didn't notice for years, I replied. Elaine intervened before the tension could harden. We'll consider it, she said. They always do. I left without an agreement, but I didn't leave empty-handed. Sometimes the most important outcome of a meeting is what doesn't get said. Their hesitation confirmed something I'd suspected since the beginning. They didn't want reform. They wanted insulation. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance. Policy language shifted subtly. Optimization was replaced with review. Efficiency softened into equity considerations. Small changes, symbolic ones, enough to suggest movement without redistributing real authority. Marcus was gone, but his logic lingered. That's another thing people misunderstand. Removing a figurehead doesn't dismantle a system. It just makes everyone feel better temporarily. Daniel called one evening. They're building a new oversight committee, he said. Who's on it? I asked. The same people, he replied, just seated differently. I sighed. Chairs don't change outcomes. No, he agreed, but optics delay accountability. Exactly. A week later, I received a message from a junior analyst I barely remembered. She'd been quiet in meetings, sharp-eyed, careful with her words. She wrote, I think something's wrong with the way our projections are being framed. Everyone keeps saying it's fixed, but it doesn't feel fixed. I stared at the message for a long time. This was how change actually happens, not through grand revelations, but through the slow accumulation of doubt among people who were taught not to trust their instincts. I replied, What are you seeing? Her response was immediate, detailed, careful. She'd noticed discrepancies in how uncertainty ranges were being presented, narrowed just enough to justify predetermined decisions. It was happening again. Not exactly the same way, but close enough. That's the danger of partial reform. It teaches people how to hide better. I could intervene, publicly, loudly, force another reckoning. Or I could do something quieter. I forwarded her message to Elaine. No commentary, no accusation, just data. 5 minutes later, Elaine replied with a single sentence. Thank you. We'll handle it. I closed my laptop. Power doesn't always need to be exercised directly. Sometimes, It's enough to remind people that someone is still paying attention. That night, I thought about the coffee line, about the man in the suit who'd laughed about a system he didn't understand, about how safe he'd felt. Safety is a fragile illusion when it's built on ignorance. The next morning, the Oversight Committee announced an expansion. New members, external review, independent audit. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't radical, but it was movement. And movement, once it starts, has a habit of attracting witnesses. I didn't celebrate, I didn't post about it, I didn't claim credit. I just watched the system do something unfamiliar. It adjusted. Not because it wanted to, but because it had learned that someone, somewhere, knew how it worked, and wasn't afraid to let it be seen. That's the real shift. Not who gets to decide, but who gets to pretend they don't. By the time the public forum was announced, everyone was pretending it had always been the plan. That's how institutions rewrite history. They don't deny what happened. They absorb it, sanitize it, and present it as foresight. The event was framed as a transparency and accountability roundtable, open to press, streamed live, carefully moderated. The kind of setting designed to look brave while remaining safe. Elaine asked if I would attend. Not to speak, not officially, just to be present. I don't sit quietly very well, I told her. She nodded. That's why I'm asking. The room was larger than any I'd been in during my contract. Bright lights, neutral colors, rows of chairs filled with journalists, policy analysts, junior staffers who sensed that proximity to this moment might matter later. Marcus's absence was noticeable. So were the empty seats beside certain donors who had quietly withdrawn. I sat in the third row, aisle seat. No nameplate, no microphone, just another woman in a dark jacket, notebook closed. The panelists spoke in familiar rhythms: acknowledgement without admission, responsibility without ownership, commitment without consequence. They discussed lessons learned, processes refined, safeguards strengthened. All true, all incomplete. Halfway through, a reporter asked the question everyone had been circling. How did this go unnoticed for so long? The panel hesitated. Then the operational lead answered. The system was complex. Oversight mechanisms existed, but... That word does a lot of work in rooms like this. But responsibility was diffuse. That was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard all day. I felt the room shift slightly. People leaned in. Diffuse responsibility is comforting until you realize it means no one is accountable. Another question followed, then another. The discussion was unraveling, not dramatically but irreversibly, like a sweater thread pulled too far. Then Elaine surprised everyone. She gestured toward me. There's someone here, she said, who understands this better than any of us. Every head turned. I stayed seated. This individual wasn't hired to make decisions, Elaine continued. She was hired to maintain integrity. The room went still. She declined a formal role today, Elaine said. But I'd like to ask her one question. She looked directly at me. What would you have done differently if you were in our position? I stood. Not because I wanted to, but because refusing would have allowed them to keep control of the narrative. I didn't move toward the stage. I didn't take a microphone. I spoke from where I was. I wouldn't have asked how it went unnoticed, I said. I would have asked who benefited from it not being seen. A ripple moved through the audience. Systems don't fail quietly, I continued. They're trained to. No one interrupted me. Every decision framework reflects the values of the people who design it and the people who approve it. If you don't know whose values those are, then the system isn't neutral. It's just unexamined. I paused.
And unexamined systems don't make mistakes, I added. They make choices.
I sat back down.
The moderator thanked me quickly and moved on, but the damage was done.
Or the repair, depending on how you looked at it. Afterward, people approached me in small groups. Quiet conversations, careful questions. Not praise. Recognition. That's different. One junior staffer said, "I didn't know we were allowed to question that." I told her, "You always are. You just aren't always protected." Outside, the cameras caught sound bites. Analysts debated tone. Commentators argued about intent. None of that mattered. What mattered was what happened next. Over the following days, other organizations began preemptive audits. Not because they'd been accused, but because they feared being next. That's how accountability spreads. Not through virtue, but through precedent. Daniel called later that week. "You changed the language," he said. "Did I?" I asked. "They're talking about decision rights now, not just outcomes." I smiled, just barely. Decision rights. Who gets them? Who doesn't? That's always been the real story. I didn't stay in D.C. I didn't accept advisory roles or think tank invitations. I turned down panels and profiles and all the subtle attempts to fold me into a safer version of myself. I returned to what I'd always done best, watching systems, listening to what they don't say, paying attention when others stop. Because the truth is, power never disappears. It just changes where it's comfortable hiding. And now, at least, it knows someone is looking. After the forum, people stopped pretending I was invisible. They didn't suddenly treat me like an authority figure either. That would have been too honest. Instead, they treated me like a variable, something that had altered the equation and now needed to be accounted for. Emails came first, careful ones, polite, vague. "We'd love your perspective. Your insights could be valuable. Perhaps an informal conversation?" Power, when unsettled, becomes very polite. I ignored most of them, not because they weren't tempting. Some offered influence, others offered money. A few offered redemption. Theirs, not mine. But I'd learned something important watching this system up close. The moment you become included, you inherit the need to compromise. And I wasn't interested in becoming a mascot for reform that stopped just short of redistribution. What interested me was pattern, and the pattern was repeating. A week after the forum, 3 separate organizations released statements announcing voluntary transparency initiatives. The language was nearly identical. Different logos, same phrasing, same promises, same absence of enforcement. It was coordination masquerading as conscience. I mapped it out one evening at my kitchen table, papers spread around me like evidence in a trial no one had agreed to attend. Same consulting firms, same policy advisors, same feedback loops. They weren't fixing the system. They were standardizing the performance of fixing it. That's when I understood the next phase wouldn't be resistance. It would be normalization. If they could make oversight look routine, bureaucratic, boring, procedural, then outrage would fade, attention would drift, and eventually, the same decisions would return under new names. People don't get tired of injustice. They get tired of paying attention. Daniel stopped by that night, unannounced. He looked exhausted. "They're trying to recruit me," he said, collapsing onto a chair. 2 offers this week. "Let me guess," I replied. "Strategic advisory roles." He laughed bitterly. "With non-disclosure agreements thicker than my mortgage." "They want you quiet," I said. "They want us all quiet," he corrected. We sat in silence for a moment. "You ever notice," he said finally, "how reform always comes with a job offer attached?" I smiled.
That's how you know it's not really reform. Here's a strange thing about being underestimated for most of your life. You learn how to operate without applause. You don't rely on validation. You don't mistake invitations for progress. That's why I noticed what others didn't. The Oversight Office published its first interim report. Buried on page 32 was a recommendation so technical most readers skipped it entirely. A suggestion to centralize model governance under a single coordinating authority. It sounded efficient. It wasn't. Centralization makes systems easier to manage and easier to capture. They were building a cleaner cage. I called Elaine. "You're moving too fast," I told her. "We're trying to keep momentum," she replied. "Momentum toward what?" I asked. "Control or accountability?" She sighed. "You can't dismantle everything." "I know," I said, "but you can choose what not to rebuild." She didn't answer. The next day, I published something of my own. Not an exposé, not an accusation. A technical paper. Dry, methodical, boring. It outlined a decentralized oversight framework that redistributed decision authority instead of consolidating it. No villains, no drama, just logic. I released it quietly. No press tour, no interviews. And then I watched. Within 48 hours, it was circulating in places I couldn't see, referenced obliquely, debated anonymously, quietly endorsed by people who'd never say so publicly. That's the kind of influence that lasts. Someone tweeted, anonymously of course, "Whoever wrote this understands where power actually breaks." That made me laugh. Humor has its moments, especially when people praise your work while still not knowing your name. A week later, the centralization proposal stalled. No explanation, no announcement, just delay. Delay is how systems admit uncertainty without losing face. I walked through a park that afternoon, watching kids argue over whose turn it was to decide the rules of a game. One of them said, "If everyone decides, it's not fair." Another replied, "If only one person decides, it's worse." They solved it by rotating turns. I wondered how many institutions would collapse if they took advice from playgrounds. That night, as I reviewed the responses to the paper, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had been useful early on. It sharpened my focus, gave me energy. But now, what I felt was something else. Resolve. I didn't need to tear the system down. I didn't need to dominate it. I just needed to make sure it could no longer pretend it was neutral while choosing winners behind closed doors. People often ask who gets to decide. The better question is, how many people have to agree before a decision becomes irreversible? And for the first time in a long while, the answer wasn't the few. The backlash didn't come loudly. That would have been easier. Instead, it arrived as distance. Meetings I was once quietly included in stopped appearing on calendars. Replies slowed. Names disappeared from email threads. Doors didn't slam, they simply failed to open. That's how institutions punish without leaving fingerprints. Daniel noticed it before I did. "They're freezing you out," he said over the phone. "Soft exclusion." "I know," I replied. "It means the paper worked." Silence is what systems use when argument fails. A month passed, then another. On the surface, things looked stable. Oversight bodies existed, reports were published, language had improved. Accountability was referenced often enough to sound sincere. Underneath, something more interesting was happening. People were hesitating. Decisions took longer. Approvals required more signatures. Committees asked follow-up questions instead of rubber-stamping conclusions. It frustrated executives. It slowed donors. It annoyed politicians. It also saved people from quietly disappearing out of datasets. Efficiency had been replaced with friction. And friction, while unpopular, is often where ethics live. The real test came when the first major funding decision stalled. A program tied to a powerful lobbying group failed to meet revised transparency thresholds. Under the old system, that would have been quietly corrected, adjusted, reframed. This time, it wasn't. The board convened an emergency session. Closed door, no press, no minutes released.
I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. 2 days later, the program was paused. Not canceled, not condemned. Paused pending review. That single word sent a message louder than any speech. The system no longer bent automatically for power. The lobbying group reacted exactly as expected. Threats, pressure, strategic outrage, and then something unusual happened. Nothing changed. No override, no exception, no quiet workaround. For the first time, influence met resistance that wasn't personal. It wasn't ideological. It was structural. You can't intimidate a framework. You can't guilt a process. You can't charm a rule that applies equally. People tried anyway. That's when the stories started. Anonymous op-eds questioning the motives behind overcorrection. Think pieces warning about paralysis. Insider whispers about how accountability was hurting progress. I read them all. They weren't wrong about everything. Friction does slow systems down. Shared decision-making is messy. Consensus takes time. But that was the point. Speed had always benefited those who already knew where they were going. Delay gave others a chance to speak. Elaine called me late one night. "They're pushing for rollback," she said. "No greeting, no preamble." Of course they are. "They're saying it's unsustainable." "Accountability always is," I replied. She exhaled. "They're asking me to choose." Between what and what, she didn't need to say. Between stability and integrity. Between control and credibility. Between comfort and consequence. "I won't advise you," I said finally. "You already know the cost of both options." She was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't expect it to go this far," she admitted. "No one ever does," I said. "Systems don't feel dangerous until they stop protecting the people in charge." The next morning, the rollback proposal failed by 1 vote. 1. That's how close it was to disappearing again. The vote wasn't public. The names weren't released. No one celebrated. But something shifted. After that, people started speaking differently in meetings, more carefully, more precisely. They stopped hiding behind abstractions, stopped saying, "the model decided," and started saying, "we chose." Language matters. It reveals ownership. A junior staffer emailed me weeks later. "I don't know if this is because of you," she wrote, "but for the first time, my concerns were addressed instead of logged." I stared at that sentence longer than I'd stared at any headline. This was never about dismantling power. It was about redistributing consequence. If you decide, you answer for it. If you benefit, you're visible. If you hide, you're questioned. That's not radical, it's just inconvenient. I walked through the city one evening, past buildings filled with people still convinced they were in control. I didn't feel anger toward them, or triumph, just clarity. The system hadn't been saved. It had been interrupted. An interruption, I'd learned, is sometimes enough to change direction. Not because people suddenly become better, but because the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the cost of adapting. Most revolutions fail because they demand purity. This one worked because it demanded attention. There was one last attempt to pull me back in. A formal offer, impressive title, broad mandate, carefully worded autonomy. I declined. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because it was familiar. I'd already seen what happens when power gets comfortable. And I had no interest in becoming the next person someone else would have to expose. Change doesn't need a throne, it needs pressure. And pressure, applied consistently, reshapes even the most rigid structures. The system was still imperfect, but it was awake now, and awake systems are harder to lie to. The last thing people expect after a long confrontation with power is quiet. They imagine closure looks like victory, like applause, like a clear ending with winners and losers neatly labeled. That isn't how it happened. Months passed. The system kept running, slower, louder in its documentation, less confident in its assumptions. Committees rotated, Oversight reports became duller, thicker, harder to skim. Executives complained about inefficiency. Analysts learned to explain their reasoning instead of pointing at charts and shrugging. No one called it a revolution. That's how I knew it was real. I moved on without moving away. No press, no book deal, no advisory board with my name engraved on glass. I returned to consulting work, quietly, selectively. Short engagements, narrow scopes, clear exit clauses. I made one rule for myself. I wouldn't stay anywhere that required me to protect a lie, even a comfortable one. That rule disqualified a surprising number of opportunities. Occasionally, someone would recognize me, not by name, by pattern, by the way I asked questions others avoided, by my habit of tracing decisions backward until the person responsible had to sit with them. Once, in a meeting, a senior executive said, half joking, "You're one of those people who make systems nervous." I smiled and replied, "Only the ones that know they should be." That got a laugh, the nervous kind. Humor, I've learned, is the last defense of people who sense accountability approaching but don't know how to stop it. Daniel and I met for coffee every few weeks. We talked less about institutions and more about ordinary things. Weather, books, the strange relief of not being inside the machine anymore. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked me once. "The proximity?" I said. He nodded. "No," I replied. "I miss the illusion that proximity meant influence." He laughed. "That illusion pays well." "So do compromises," I said. "Until they don't." Elaine sent me a short message near the end of the year. "We're holding, barely, but we're holding." I didn't reply right away. Holding is harder than changing. It requires vigilance without drama, attention without adrenaline, the willingness to be unpopular in rooms where comfort has always been currency. Eventually, I wrote back, "That's enough for now." On a cold evening not long after, I found myself back in that federal building, not inside but across the street waiting for a friend. I watched people file out after work, suits, badges, paper cups of coffee that tasted like regret. I wondered how many of them believed they decided things, how many actually did, how many benefited from not knowing the difference. Here's the truth no one teaches you. Decision-making is not about authority. It's about exposure to consequence. The people who decide most comfortably are the ones least affected by the outcomes. The people who suffer most rarely get a vote. Systems are built to preserve that imbalance unless someone interrupts it. I didn't interrupt it because I was brave, or angry, or special. I interrupted it because I understood it. And understanding, applied patiently, is one of the few things power can't negotiate with. Every so often, I still receive messages from analysts, from junior staffers, from people who've started noticing gaps between what systems claim and what they do. They ask what to do. I never tell them to expose anyone, or to fight publicly, or to sacrifice themselves for a principle no one else will defend. I tell them this instead. Learn how the system works. Learn who benefits when it stays quiet. Then decide where you're willing to apply pressure, because pressure doesn't need permission, and it doesn't need a title. It only needs consistency. The world is full of people who think they decide everything. Most of them are wrong. Decisions are made by those who shape the conditions quietly enough that no one thinks to question them. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And once you stop pretending you're powerless, the system feels it, even if it never learns your name. That's how it ended, not with collapse, but with awareness. And awareness, unlike authority, doesn't expire when someone leaves the room. Before I step away, there's something I want to say, not as a warning, not as advice, just as an observation. Most systems don't collapse. They persist, quietly, comfortably. They rely on the fact that people get tired of paying attention, tired of asking who decides, tired of noticing when something feels off but can't quite explain why. If this story resonated with you, it's probably because you felt that tension too. That moment when you realized decisions affecting real lives were being made far away by people who would never feel the consequences themselves. And if you've ever wondered whether one person paying attention long enough could actually make a difference, you already know the answer. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, stories about quiet power, invisible decisions, and women who were underestimated for far too long, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. These stories take time to write, and I read every comment you leave. I really do. Let me know what you noticed, what you questioned, what stayed with you after the story ended. Because awareness doesn't end when the video does, and the next story is already waiting.